Welcome back to Faith, Frauds, and Falsehoods, where we discuss and explore the various cults and religions of the world. Tonight, we're going to keep going on our discussion of the Institute in Basic Life Principles. I still can't say it, Matt.
IBLP.
The IBLP. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and help others to find us.
Hey, before we begin, let's make it very clear. The opinions that we present are ours alone. They do not represent the views or opinions of our respective churches or employers. Now let's begin.
Absolutely. So tonight we start, I guess I might release this in the morning, but we're recording tonight, so I can say tonight.
Yes.
We're starting the series of episodes that talk mostly about the teachings of the IBLP. This is where some of the rubber really meets the road, right? The history is fun. It's entertaining, it's interesting, it's useful, but it's not nearly as impactful as looking at what they teach and what they did teach. Because they're
foreshadowing.
I know, right? They're an interesting group, Matt. I don't know how much you dug into the teachings. I know you like to focus in on the social issues more than the theology like I do, but
dug in on the teachings. I've studied most of this for years. What you talking about?
Oh, that's true. That's true. But I don't know. After Gothard left, they seem to have tried to rebrand themselves. So we'll come back to that when we get to the response, especially, and we start to ask the question of, are they really a cult? So it was hard, right? This has been a difficult one to research because the stuff that they have out there now is not the same stuff that was there 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Right. So we want to make that real clear. We're talking about the teachings classically.
Right.
The Bill Gothard led teachings.
Yes, specifically under Gothard, right? Whether those are still enforced, I think some of them are, some of them aren't. Some of them are in different ways, right? So that way the same kind of issues are hopefully, I don't want to say negated, but hidden at the very least. So let's start by talking about the key influences and inspirations that affected the IBLP in 1961, right? So, Matt, if you remember the 60s, we talk about the 60s a lot.
Yeah, we do. A lot of cults
60s
came
and
from the
70s. There's a lot of the cults that we've talked about so far that originated in that time period. There's a lot of cults that kind of died out in that time period that we'll eventually get to talk about. But there was a lot of stuff going on, right? But we can see as we look at Gothard's teachings, I picked out 4 kind of key influences, right? And when I say influence, Matt, you called me on this the other day, and you said, how do you see that this influenced them in this way, right? I'm not looking at them taking beliefs from these teachings and applying them, right? I'm looking at them taking the context, right? So the holiness movement, right? There's a lot of pieces of the holiness movement that run through IBLP, right? For those that don't know, the holiness movement comes from Methodism in the mid-19th century, right? So mid to late 1800s. And it was
a whole lot of movements and denominations and things have grown from the teachings of John Wesley.
Yep.
A lot of things he said. People always think of the Methodists, or the Wesleyans came from John Wesley, but actually a whole lot of different denominations
a lot of them did. Yep.
Came from that.
Yep. So there was a big stress in this holiness movement on moral purity. Like you said, Wesley wasn't a founder of this, wasn't a teacher in this. Rather, early followers in the holiness movement thought of Wesley's teachings as being watered down, right? And I don't know if you've read some of Wesley's teachings, but they don't seem very watery to me. But these people thought that they were, and so they wanted to restart with some of his earlier teachings to really push them further. There's a huge strain on the moral code within the holiness movement that is pretty much impossible to live up to, right? Without having something that pushes you down and makes you guilty. And we see that a lot in Gothard's teachings. Maybe not specifically calling it holiness, but applying this strict moral code is still there.
Right. And so you're talking about they pulled pieces of it because they obviously didn't pull the worship style from the holiness movement.
Right. Yep.
Quite the opposite.
But there is the strains of the same context running through the IBLP, right? So we see that really big in the Christian fundamentalist movement from the early 20th century, so a little bit after the holiness movement. And we see at that point there was a group of Presbyterians that rejected all the modernization of the church that was going on and said, we have to get back to the fundamentals, right? Now, Matt, I know that you're a Baptist, right? And you told me the other day that you're like, most Baptists are fundamentalists. And I disagree with you because
you're using a different definition.
Well, because the fundamentalists, right, of the early 20th century basically had this list of fundamentals that if you did not adhere to this list, you could not be saved. Right? So there was a very, very strict set of fundamentalists, of fundamental beliefs that they applied to everything. The big one that you were confused about was the inerrancy of Scripture through verbal inspiration. And that's a statement that I think you had indicated you really hadn't heard before, right? Because it's not a common teaching within the Baptist traditions, right?
Right.
So what did you find out what that means? Did you do any more digging, or did you just want me to talk about it?
Go ahead.
Okay. So this idea of verbal inspiration within the fundamentalist sect, right, is a very literalistic. God himself sat down with Moses and said, write these words in this order, in this way, right? And so when you take that idea, right, what happens is then every individual word of the scriptures becomes something more than it was meant to be when it was originally written, right? It becomes a high point, right? So you can go and you can look at something in Ezekiel and say, this applies to me, right? Because God himself said it, right? He said it knowing everyone that was ever going to read it, and so therefore it applies to me, right? Or you wind up with the Flat Earth Society, right? Because you have to accept the fact when David writes that God placed the earth on the pillars of the foundation, right, of the world, and placed the firmament in the heavens, that it must be a physical, literal dome sitting on a table, right, in God's office, right? Because you have to, right? You have to get to that point. But that's only one piece of the fundamentals. I could go on
and not anything that
specific.
the IBLP teaches.
Well, it is, right?
Well, they don't teach flat Earth. You're linking them into flat Earth, but they're not teaching flat Earth. That.
Right, but they are teaching the verbal inspiration, which is one of the reasons that Gothard pulls so many Bible verses, right? And as we talked about with Westboro, proof texts them, right? Or worse, misapplies them, right? Skips verses to get the meaning that he wants, because every individual word can be used to apply whatever you want it to mean.
Well, I was always taught there's a problem with the verbal thing because of the many language translations of the Bible. Now, some people solve this by doing King James for KJV only. I think there's some problems with that. But the fundamentalist teaching that I was taught was the inerrancy of scriptures, that all scripture is true. Scripture is good for teaching and preaching and da-da-da. And that scripture is true. Not necessarily, I mean, not that, the word "the" has to be the word that's there on that chapter and verse. We know the chapter and verse weren't there originally. However, I was very much taught that scripture is not up to us to change.
Right.
Our understanding may change over time, and that's definitely happened. But the scripture itself does not change, and is not for us to add to it or subtract from it. Right. And that was the fundamentalist belief that I was taught on that.
Yeah.
That may not be the Presbyterian sect of fundamentalists and the so-and-sos, but that's sure the fundamentalists that I was taught in the 90s.
Yeah. The real issue in this case is the verbal inspiration portion of the teaching. But they also teach, the fundamentals as, the virgin birth of Jesus. Perfectly fine. Substitutionary atonement at a minimum. Penal substitution is much more common today, which is an episode all in itself. The bodily resurrection of Christ, the authenticity of miracles, and the second coming of Christ. Right. So pretty normal, fundamentals of Christianity. Right. If you want to refute or refuse the Nicene Creed, which is, the fundamentals from the 300s. Same thing.
So the Nicene Creed disagrees with these 6 things?
No, the Nicene Creed would agree with these, aside from the verbal inspiration of scriptures.
Okay.
And
so there's no
substitutionary atonement. Yeah. No, the church has always taught something along these lines, right?
Okay.
Differences in the atonement and scriptures portions, but those are easily worked around. So carrying on, so we can keep this episode under the 15-minute mark if we can.
Talk fast.
Is the guruism, right, of the 60s and 70s, right? I don't know how much that you know about the New Age movement that really struck, especially the West Coast in the 60s and 70s.
Quite a bit. Some of the cults we've studied have been as part of that.
A lot of them have come from this guruism.
Yeah, and he was very much playing into that I can help you have a better life. He started with the young people, which is where a lot of them started with. I can help you have a better life. He just had a more Christian slant to it than some others. Some were trying to reject the churches they grew up in. Right. He was like, no, embrace the church you grew up in. Let's go further with this. You're not taking it far enough. He kind of went the other direction, but he was going to the same point.
Yeah. Yeah. So some of the gurus of the 60s and 70s were very much, New Agey, Eastern, but they all presented some form of technique, right? Some technique of personal growth and self-realization. Right?
And he wasn't asking people, hey, follow me. He was saying, follow these things.
He was saying, follow this plan that I've put together.
Yep. Right. And he came to be almost worshipped. He was revered, we would say, rather than worshipped. He was definitely revered. But often that happens with lots of preachers who are successful, or maybe not successful, or popular. Right. You and I have worked both in big churches. And again, these are our opinions and nothing to do with those churches that we work with. But that happens sometimes in big churches. You'll see some churches it does happen, and some that intentionally work for that to not happen.
Right.
And I won't name any names, but y'all could easily think of examples of those things. So that's almost, it's like, well, we can almost forgive him for that because that's going to happen. Except he keeps going.
Yep. And we'll get into some of the things that he gets to later on. But I wanted to point out, Father Seraphim Rose of the 60s and 70s and 80s, he wrote a book called Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. I had to look at it to see exactly what the name of it was. And he writes a lot about this Eastern influence in the U.S. and how it's negatively impacting Christianity. And he can say a lot of these things because he fell into it, right? He went to this New Agey stuff. He became a part of it. And then Christ got a hold of him and he became a monk and moved out, started writing all these things. But he writes, at the time of the initiation, the guru gives his disciple a mantra, and this determines the path he will follow. In effect, the guru invites his disciple to prove the philosophy by his own experience. So if you remember back when we talked about Embassy University last week, that's exactly what Gothard was doing through Embassy, right? He was giving people the mantra to say every night, and this was determining the path they will follow. So even if he's not intentionally taking the teachings of the guru, right? He's taking the same concepts, the same marketing ideas, the same how do we communicate these ideas, and applying it to his own Christian teachings.
Oh, I think that he's seen what was happening around him. I mean, he's seen this as a crusade to pull people away from such things.
Okay.
That definitely is a thread that goes all through the organization, is a crusade to pull people away from such things.
Right.
That goes through their political movement, through their homeschool movement, that sort of thing. You've seen the thing where they had a whole movement to change politics in America by putting people in positions.
Right.
All that was to change the culture. It was a culture war.
Mm-hmm.
It is a culture war.
A whole lot of culture war going on here.
I don't think that's not a real thing even. So yeah, I imagine he, had seen that all happening around him. So what's your one last thing you got on this section?
So the one that you were most confused by is the word faith movement. Another early 20th century teaching that words that believers speak have power, right? So through positive confession, specific effects can be expected.
Name it,
these
claim
are people, right? Name it, claim it. These are people like Kenneth Hagin,
and we'll theorize.
William Branham.
Let me specify confused by. It's not confused by because I have no idea about it.
Right.
I understand the word of faith movement quite much. I've studied.
You just don't see how that connection is made.
My question is how you were making the connection to the IBLP.
So a lot of Gothard's teachings, and especially today, I mean, I was bored at work today, so I sat and listened to some of his seminars. A lot of his teaching is this speaking, right, these kinds of things to be better, right? He's not, again, right, this comes back to, we're not talking, he's taking the word faith movement and applying it, right? But he's taking this idea, and especially when you take his understanding of the Bible, right, as we see in Embassy specifically, when you take that and you apply this success model to it, you can see that there is some influence, maybe not people name it and claim it prosperity gospel type of things, right? But the idea that I can be positive, I can say positive things, and good things come from that, right?
Okay.
Doesn't necessarily have to do with prosperity gospel, right? As we see the word faith movement today having become. But I think there is some strain of that within the IBLP at some level. So, Matt, that 18 minutes, I was close. That covers the influences that I can immediately see, right? I'm sure that there are far more that are out there. So if you know them in the comments, if you could say, hey, I think he was also influenced by X, right? Let us know. I would love to chat with you about it because I enjoy this kind of thing. I promise.